Okay, welcome everyone to the Mining the Consumer Gap session of the Insurance Summit. I'm so happy you've decided to join us for this exciting panel that is going to talk about the impact of the gaps that consumer understanding of insurance company and adjuster processes are having on the insurance industry and on consumers. They strive to have their claims paid in a timely manner. Our presenters are going to address issues and answer questions posed by the moderator. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our moderator, Minnesota Insurance Commissioner Grace Arnold, and our distinguished panelists whose bios are posted on the website and available on the mobile app for your review. The first panel, to start the panel, we have Amy Lambrecht from Idaho, John Marinovich, Nebraska, Jill Kruger from South Dakota, and also we have on the panel TJ Patton from Minnesota, Vicki Trice from Tennessee, and Cindy Wright from Texas. And now, Commissioner Arnold.
All right, thank you, Lois. So I think there are a couple of, do we need to do the CE logistics, Lois? Okay, great. So I'm really excited about this panel because as I thought about, what we were going to have here at the summit, one of the data points that I often use, which is not great, but is why we're having this, our complaints in Minnesota have more than doubled in the last 3 years. So in 2020, we had about 500, and in 2023, we had about 1,200. And that's for a lot of reasons, but it's also telling us a lot of things about the market. And so we're going to unpack this expertise of the folks on this panel who are overseeing the consumer assistance or consumer affairs functions in their department. This group has been meeting over the summer and had a lot of really good conversations about sort of what's top of mind for them in their work. And then we use that to sort of build out a two focus areas here. So Lois, if you want to go to the next slide. Oh, never mind. Sorry. Back. There. So as we are going through this, we're going to talk about kind of two main things. The one is massive rate increases. So if you're in the insurance department, how many people have dealt with, or if you're at a company who's dealt with a massive rate increase recently? Everyone, hands up. And so I can tell you that we've had over 60 filings in Minnesota that have larger than 25% rate increases, right? So in property and casualty in particular, this is a big issue. The second that we're going to talk about is third party there's a whole host of issues, but there are complaints that have been filed by third parties, and that has a number of implications for the way that we do our work as insurance departments, but also it kind of tells some things about things that are going on in the industry. So we're going to talk a little bit about that too. I want to highlight a few other things that came up as kind of top issues, but we don't have time because we only have 50 minutes, so we don't have time to go through today. But I think these are helpful for this group to know that as this group was preparing, these are the kinds of things that we're seeing as top issues coming in when consumers reach us. So non-renewals, so whether that's due to wildfires or other disasters, negligence, other kinds of things. Rising incivility from complainants. I think that is one that companies are dealing with. It's one that we've certainly dealt with in Minnesota, where there are just some complainants that could perhaps take some lessons from my elementary school children. Agents switching consumers from one health plan to another without their consent was the sixth complaints from medical providers. So we're not going to touch too much on the medical provider portion, but that when we're thinking about third parties, that's another avenue that we're getting a lot of complaints. And then the final, which is probably worth an entire session on its own, was roofing scams, and we've heard about some of those in other committees at the national meetings. So we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to sort of break this up into a couple of things. So one, we're going to talk about process management. There is a lot that goes into resolving a consumer's complaint. There are a lot of things that these folks have learned from each other or are thinking about as they're dealing with a lot of these complaints. Connecting and collaborating. So where do we start? How do we talk to each other? How do we talk to our consumers? And then how do you deal with some of the external and internal issues that come with some of the new environments that we're seeing. And then we'll also talk about education. There's a lot of communication and education that goes into the consumer function, and that can be particularly challenging in some of these cases, so we're going to talk through those. So I was going to ask the panel to do a lightning round of their favorite barbecue, but I'm not about to start any wars today, so let's start out with education. So I'm going to start with you, John, if you want to just say, because there, all right. What strategies have been shared by other states, or what are you thinking about in Nebraska to increase consumer awareness and education, before they even get to you in your division?
Sure. One of the things we have been looking at is consumer bulletins, partnering with insurance companies and local news to make sure that we are getting information out there so that people are aware of why these rate increases are happening, what factors go into that. And we get a lot of calls about that because most of the rate increase forms indicate that we approve them. So we get the call of, why did you approve them? And so then we have to talk to them about what that process looks like and how insurance works, how they have to increase premiums in order to meet their obligations and that sort of thing. So all of those strategies together.
Great. Anyone else want to talk about any strategies they're using before we go on to the next question? TJ. Oh, Amy and then TJ.
Go ahead, TJ.
One of the things that I would add in Minnesota, we've spent the last few years working on our website redesign. I think there's been a real shift in the way that people absorb information, and I don't always know that we're reaching them in the way that's likeliest for them to digest and retain it. We already know that most people aren't reading their notices or policies or any type of letter they get in the mail, certainly from insurance companies. And so one of the things in Minnesota we've been really trying to do is make sure that our website is findable and accessible for people to try and help educate them maybe even before they file something with us.
Amy, anything you'd like to add?
So I would say something similar, that we had updated our website a few years back, and we tried to make it consumer friendly, where we just have answers to the most common questions and complaints that we have. And we find a lot of people will come to our website. We have a similar issue where people tend not to read anything that's mailed to them or even emailed to them. And so we encourage them to give us a call. And then we have to be prepared, similar issues to where they call the company and the company says, the state required it, even sometimes they think, or approved it. And so what we do is we then coach them and talk about how our state's rates and approval works, but also having them go back to the company or agent and ask for more specific information. And then if they don't get an answer they like, then file a complaint with us.
Just to add on to that, in South Dakota, we have a pretty good relationship with our producer population. And in South Dakota, in the communities, they are very trusted professionals. And so instead of us trying to go to all of the consumers, we try to work with them too to keep them up to date. We just had staff that attended one of their conferences and did a presentation on this exact thing.
Vicki, you want to add something?
I was trying to see if my mic was going to work. So we actually post our rate increase files on our website for the consumers. So when they call in with those questions, we'll go to that area and talk to them one-on-one about the company, whatever issues are going on there. But that has helped us a lot. We do a lot of education and outreach in Tennessee, and we are constantly being swamped with questions about the rate increase process. So,
yeah.
Wanted to circle back to what TJ was saying too. So we have a great communications team in Texas. Same thing. I think all of us here have probably done website redesigns, but I think we're always looking for ways to reach people. We do a blog. We have, we have YouTube postings. We have a lot of social media presence too, and a program that we call Insure Ed, where we're outreaching through our website with some educational. Sometimes for CE, other times just for information. So I think we're all kind of interested in the same thing and getting the message out there as best we can.
And I'll just add on to what Jill and South Dakota are doing. You know, we're always looking in Minnesota for places where we can collaborate with industry. Well, producers are just as angry about what's happening with non-renewals and rates and difficulty placing business as we as regulators are. And so I think it's a really apt place for us to try and make sure we're collaborating fully because like Jill said, I mean, that is the person in their community that they're likely to rely on heaviest when it comes to making insurance decisions.
All right, thank you all. So I heard a lot about rates, right? And so that's, I think, what we have been talking about. I've done a number of interviews, but having a rate sort of approved in abstract through a filing is very different from what happens when, like, I got my renewal increase, which was shocking. And prompted an interesting conversation with my husband where he learned what I do all day, other than sit on calls or take calls at odd hours. So John, maybe let's start with you again. Can you talk about like how are the complaints coming in, and what are consumers saying when they call, and what's the experience then to sort of drive it back into this very macro trend that we're seeing?
Yes. So for us, especially in Nebraska, our rates have gone up specifically in homeowners because we are a storm-prone state. There were the Arbor Day tornado that hit Omaha recently. We're also a fairly small population state, so that means high costs borne out by fewer people. And so most people look at insurance as not a state-by-state issue. Most consumers don't look at it that way. And so they see, well, why does Florida have lower rates than we do? Well, Florida has a lot more people. And so trying to explain all of that information in a brief complaint can be very difficult when you have somebody whose emotions are a little higher. So we always want to make sure that we're driving down to the issue and making sure that they understand we are not making these decisions in a vacuum. And that leads to some very interesting conversations. Sometimes we get hung up on, sometimes we have somebody who starts to understand a little better and can leave better educated.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult for a consumer and individual policyholder to understand the scale. You know, regardless of your state's population size, how many carriers you have writing in a specific line of business, when you go beyond what they as individuals are facing with their rate increase in a letter that they kind of get out of the blue as they near renewal, it is really difficult to get them to expand out and think about what's going on writ large across the state. And I'll be honest, I haven't cracked the code. Half the time I worry that I'm actually making people more upset by trying to answer their questions, which isn't a great track record of success, but I think it actually, my hope is that if enough people have enough conversations, that eventually people will start to know more than when they first came to you with some type of issue.
I can appreciate I don't want to make someone more upset than they already are comment, but one of the issues I think that we hear about a lot is no one ever told me. Right, this happened and I never knew, and I think that can be for a number of reasons. I mean, won't ask for a show of hands, but I think just delivery methods now are so different. Consumers might not get a paper packet in the mail anymore. They might not be noticing a lot of these things that happen, and I think probably some of us included, that you might not pick up on something within that notice period that you might have, in years past. And so we can definitely, verify that notice requirements were, followed and all of that kind of thing. But in the end, the answer is the answer, and so sometimes that can not make people happier.
So Tennessee has seen a lot of different weather events. We've had tornadoes, we've had wildfires, we've had floods, and our rates are all over the place. And so really trying to explain that to people. We have a lot of uninsured drivers, but if we say that in the conversation to the person that's complaining about their auto rates, they get angry because I'm having to pay for somebody else who doesn't have insurance. So you have to, you have to kind of tread lightly when you're trying to explain the entire process when it comes to the rate increases.
All right, I'm going to start with Jill on this one. So we've talked a lot about complaints trending and those kinds of things. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how you're thinking forward and knowing that this is probably a position we'll be in for a little bit at a minimum? Can you talk about what in South Dakota you're kind of thinking about now?
Sure. So just, a couple of years ago, before this even, we saw this change in the property casualty area, we took a step back, and our staff that were consumer complaint analysts, we tried to shift the focus from complaint to what they're really doing is educating people, because when they're dealing with complaints, how many of them are actually confirmed complaints? I mean, it really is an educational piece. But we also know that they have to have the tools available for them. And so whether you do education to, like we all talked about earlier, you do a lot of education and outreach to folks in your state. We do it more one-on-one through the complaint process or the education there, or focusing on like the outreach to groups that have direct connection.
All right, anyone else want to talk about how you're preparing or even have adjusted your processes or the way that you talk about things as you kind of look and know that this is something that will be, probably continuing for the next little bit?
I think the answer, I'm not sure which person mentioned it, is that, we're at least where I'm at, I've been seeing claims, hundreds of thousands of claims, and when we're sitting, we can see a lot of the factors that are affecting the rates. But when it's that person that you're on the phone with that's struggling just to buy gas and eat, it's very personal to them. So I think it's a little harder you can't go into some technical explanation. And I think for us, it's just understanding how to talk to them about how they can verify exactly why their rates went up, and see if there's something they can do to help minimize that a bit. Maybe if they can tolerate deductible changes or whatnot. We also have, just as some of these other states, Idaho's a small state, we have a really trusted producer community, and so they're a resource for the consumers. But it's in educating it with the person that's calling, it's very personal. And at this time, with what's going on with the economy, a lot of people, it's just one more thing that they're struggling with. How am I going to pay this?
Just one thing I wanted to add to that, Grace. So I think we really consider in South Dakota it's a balance, because we need to have a healthy market, and so you don't want to shift too far to the consumer side. We need companies there, so it's really a balance, and we need to be careful about making knee-jerk reactions when we consider legislation or how we move forward, because we don't want to wreck the industry there so that we have more folks leave.
Go ahead.
Something that I've been thinking about was a conversation I had earlier this summer with a career agent, 30 or 40 years in the P&C space. And she said that she's really encouraging her policyholders to think about P&C coverage as catastrophic coverage, to think about what amount they could potentially self-insure, so to speak, if they had to. At what threshold do they actually go through and file the claim? Now, for some people, for lower income folks, that coverage and being able to make that decision might not even be a possibility. But I thought it was fascinating that essentially this agent's office had gotten so many unhappy phone calls that the entire way that she has thought about describing the coverage and how people might think about either increasing their deductible or reducing some of their coverage limits when possible, and only using it for serious events to their property. I thought that was really both sad and also maybe one thing that state insurance departments can be thinking about when we talk to our consumers that are upset about costs.
I want to pick up on something that Jill and TJ both said. So one of the things that I've used is the analogy of balance when I talk about or do media inquiries. I'm wondering if you have a particular analogy or a particular sort of way of framing the discussions that you found particularly helpful when you have the conversations or when your team are having the conversations.
So I'd say no. I mean, it's very hard because obviously when you're talking to folks, I mean, they care about what's happening to them, and it's hard for folks to understand. Commissioner Gottfried over the lunch talked about how consumers are more aware, but they're still so far to go. So, breaking down insurance in general is hard, much less how rates are set and how, the entire state affects you, and it's hard for them to absorb that. So I'll be interested in anybody else's advice.
I don't know why, but I can't help but think back to our friends with the Pennsylvania department that rolled out, it's either comic strips or stick figure animations for explaining insurance topics. And, I don't know that's the answer, but I do think we need to be trying alternative forms of addressing these issues that may result in people tuning in long enough to get the information they're looking for. But like Jill, I certainly don't have the answer.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, trying to get that information out there, because for too many people, their primary source of information about insurance is a friend of a friend. Mm-hmm. There's my friend told me that his friend had this happen, and so why isn't it like that? Because that's not how insurance works. So it is a challenge to make sure that either we or the industry is the primary source of information rather than hearsay.
All right. Any last words on the markets and rates before we move on to our second set of topics? Anybody want to have the last word? All right. So the second set of topics that we're going to talk about are sort of two things that are bucketed together here, but they kind of, some of them are related. So we've seen, I think probably every insurance department has seen a really big increase in complaints filed by third parties. And tangential to that is also a lot of kind of things that are going on in the adjuster market. So I'm going to start with the complaints by third parties. And so Vicki, maybe I can start with you. And can you just talk through a little bit about what you're seeing, how you're dealing with it, and maybe some of the challenges or opportunities that you have taken advantage of. That's enough. But let's start with what you're seeing, and then we can go on to the other ones.
This is going to take a minute. So we have seen a significant increase in complaints, in Tennessee, primarily from public adjusters. We don't get complaints from roofers and things. I know some of the states do that, but our biggest issue are the public adjuster community. And they come to us because they feel like that they're being lowballed by the company. And, we actually handle those complaints that come in from the public adjusters. They're licensed through our office, and they have a contract with the policyholder. So we're able to do those and actually get a response from the carrier on most of those situations. Other persons that contact us, sometimes attorneys, no, if you've already been retained by that policyholder, then you need to do your job and you're getting paid to do that. And we basically tell them that if they've already, signed a contract with the policyholder, that we can't handle it. The complaint would actually have to come in from the policyholder in order for us to try to assist with those. But that's about all I want to say.
All right, what have others seen in terms of third parties filing complaints? And then we've talked a little bit about some of the process issues, so I want to get to that next. But what are you seeing kind of as a trend? Go ahead, Sidi.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to actually follow up on that. But so trends that we've seen in third-party complaints, similar to Tennessee. We've seen a pretty big increase in public insurance adjuster complaints. And it's an interesting kind of, it feels different, of course, when it's one licensee complaining against another one. You kind of handle those in a different way. And they tend to be a lot more complex than a consumer complaint would be. So they tend to take us longer too. Sometimes we'll have to, there's a lot of back and forth with it. So they tend to grind our process a little bit. And when they come at us on volume, then it makes it that much more difficult. So in Texas last year, we received 25,999 complaints. And there weren't a tremendous number of them against public adjusters, or filed by public adjusters, but enough that it definitely makes an impact to your resolution times. And so I forgot the rest of the question, but you know, it's definitely been an issue for us. Other third parties, I guess, you know, we're a comparative negligence state, and when we have third-party claimants that file a complaint, those can be a little bit tricky because a lot of the time they're being filed because either the liability decision didn't go their way, or maybe that there's an uncooperative insured that's not being responsive to, you know, the insurance company, and the claim kind of processes a lot slower than they would like. So, and then a lot of people, of course, are like, well, why should I file a claim with I don't want my rates to go up. I don't want to file a claim with my own insurance company when it's the other person's fault. So those can be a little, you know, delicate to handle. And then, you know, you mentioned medical providers. We get those. We have sort of a parallel process with those in Texas. One of the things that I was really, I don't know, part of the conversations that we had over the summer that I thought were really interesting were some alternate processes that other states had come up with to handle these kinds of things. I think, you know, a few states are requiring that in a third-party situation that they obtain written consent from the insured in order to process the complaint. Thought that was great. And then other states have used specific forms for like body shops and things like that. So there's a lot of good, I think, you know, at least in the complaint space, there's a lot of good innovation out there to try to make things a little bit easier for consumers and get answers a little bit quicker.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that. Nebraska is one of the states that created a specific written consent form in order for public adjusters to file complaints, because they were in that space where they're licensed by us, so they're regulated by us, but they're also working for the consumer. So we wanted to make sure that consumers were aware that their public adjuster could file on their behalf, but then they couldn't go in and file again if they didn't get the answer they wanted. So we wanted to make sure there was some very specific documentation on that.
In Minnesota, you know, whatever your state department's staff number is, whether it's 50, 100, 250, that's 50, 100, 250 points of information that are available to you internally. And so we want the information. So if it's a body repair shop, a building repair contractor, an independent or public adjuster, any of those people could have information that would be very helpful to us in terms of what's going on in the marketplace that we otherwise wouldn't have an eye line into. But it does create process challenges, which we've talked about. But there's something else that we've had a lot of conversations about in Minnesota, and that is what I believe to be the difficulty of carriers, of our major carriers, in terms of their own staffing since the pandemic. So each time a carrier asks me to meet with them, they try and twist my arm for whatever it is they're trying to get out of me. And then I have kind of just a stock series of questions about what they're seeing for claim volume and what are they expecting for premium rate, what are their loss ratios, and how is it going with staffing? Because we had one of our major carriers, you know, report that they had hired 4,000 new adjusters nationwide last year. And so those 4,000 people need to get trained up. They need to get experience under their belt. And so for each one of those people, how many times do they drop the ball on a claims handling issue? And so I think that's indicative of why we may be seeing more complaints or inquiries come from some of these other third-party types. It's because our consumers and policyholders are struggling to keep regular contact with their adjuster and insurance company. And so our consumers are looking for other sources of information. And so, again, there are process challenges, but, you know, we really try and embrace the information being reported by those parties.
I just wanted to add on to that. So when we began this process and started having these conversations and then preparing for this, when we looked at South Dakota, I really thought I'd see a big spike in South Dakota complaints, and we haven't. But what we've seen is that the complaints are more complex for the exact reasons TJ was saying. So they're open longer, whereas before you'd have people that maybe had been in the industry for a while on both sides, both our staff and company staff. So a complaint could be a one and done communication and it would be resolved. I think that's rarely the case anymore. It's taking much more.
So in Idaho, we don't have a spike in third parties. What I've seen, so as the supervisor, I review a lot of cases and you just said it, problematic, where it's taking a long time. And unfortunately, from my perspective, a lot of those have to do with service providers, misinforming consumers, and then it's kind of a battle of the wills. And sometimes the insurance company could do a better job. Sometimes they've slowed down, but a lot of times the consumer's being told one thing from maybe a provider or a body shop or a roofer or contractor, and then they're getting different information from their insurance company. And those, we gather information, we regulate the insurance company, but that seems to create a layer of problems that make those cases just drag on. And hopefully I'm not jumping ahead. And then that kind of sets up to where there's an expectation somehow that we would be able to resolve issues that we don't have the authority to resolve.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and, so, in a lot of these cases, the consumer isn't there, or they are there but tangentially. Can you talk a little bit about how then you sort of either loop the consumer in, or what happens with the consumer's expectation, or sort of how you work through the processes? And I know you can kind of, as we went through some of the conversations, like privacy came up and forms, and so feel free to take any of those sort of journeys, because I think each of them are really interesting to kind of fill out this picture of what happens to you and your teams when you have either a more complicated case, a case where the consumer is or isn't there, the consumer does or doesn't know that the complaint's being filed. So, Vicki, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So one of the things that we always try to do is to make sure that the consumer is aware that the complaint has been filed, even if it's a provider complaint or whatever's going on. We try to loop that consumer in just to make sure that they're aware. The provider complaints, we usually tend to get pushback from the carriers on those complaints because they feel like the provider has a written contract with them and they are supposed to go through their provider resolution process before anything else, and so sometimes they'll push back and they will not respond to those complaints from us. So we have to tell the provider to please go ahead and follow the terms of your contract, and we'll start trying to work the complaint from our end, things of that type. But and Tennessee also has an interesting thing going on right now that's just been kind of recent, where we've got public adjusters that also have contractor licenses. Our contractor board is under TDCI as well, and so we've got these public adjusters that have a public adjuster license. They also have a contractor license, and it kind of feels like that probably shouldn't be happening. And I think some of the states probably have something in their laws that doesn't allow that, but in Tennessee, we don't have that right now. This is fairly new to us, so that's another road that we're getting ready to have to go down as well. And I probably didn't answer your question.
No. Anyone else want to add on? So how are you thinking about the consumer in these cases where you have third-party complaints?
I think this is one area where we did see a lot of differences in how states are handling it. In my state, we're not necessarily looping in the consumer if someone else filed the complaint. The way we would address that is just in what information is able to be released to the complainant. So sometimes they're not able to get the company response because that's got sensitive information in it, or something along those lines. But definitely was very interested to hear Nebraska and some of the other states' process for handling the third-party complaints.
Anyone else want to add in?
So in Idaho, we would typically need the consumer to file the complaint is what we require to look at their specific insurance. As far as third party, I think with the medical, we may have providers that come to us, and I find myself spending a lot of time maybe working with a smaller provider explaining to them, because a lot of times, truthfully, they're coming to us and it's Medicaid or Medicare, it's not even within our jurisdiction. And so we do get them a contact, have the company reach out to them, but often I'm educating them on, okay, each one of your patients has a different type of insurance, and you need to figure out what kind of insurance it is. So I find myself spending time trying to educate them. And then the good thing is after we explain that to them, then they might give us a call back. And then we can try to help them figure out how can you, again, I use the word vet, determine for the problems that you're having, what kind of insurance is, and then how do we help you get to who you need to get to for help.
Yeah, I think there's just so many different situations when it comes to third parties filing the complaint. So if you have an auto body repair shop that's filing the complaint on behalf of a policyholder based on what an insurance company's staff adjuster said they were going to pay for, the hourly labor rate or the paint reimbursement rate, those are some of the things that we hear from most often. And so there are sometimes topics that we can engage with the third party on because it's not specific to any one policyholder. But if there is a specific claim that makes up part of it, we let the complaining party know that we're going to contact the policyholder, make sure that they're aware of the complaint, and to ask them from their perspective what the issues are. And I agree when it comes to medical providers filing a complaint. I try and ask my team to be prepared to be an educational resource when medical providers provide complaints, because as everyone in this room is well aware, our healthcare system is very complicated. And it's very difficult, even for providers that have a copy of the insurance card, maybe some of the policy information in their systems, to be able to identify which regulatory authority is at issue for whatever it is that they are reporting. When it comes to public adjusters, I think public adjusters, if insurance companies are trying to limit the amount that they pay out on a claim, I think it's in a public adjuster's best interest to try and expand out the amount that's being paid on the claim. And so you also have to keep in perspective that there are going to be biases depending on who it is that's reporting the information. And so it's just important to know your state privacy laws may limit the things that you can talk about with the third party, but also you have to keep in perspective any biases that may be present when they're the ones bringing you the information.
So just, I do a lot on the health side also. So like on the health side, my one piece of advice that if I had to leave somebody with one piece of advice, it is to never pay a clinic bill or a hospital bill before you get your EOB, so you know what you actually owe. And on the PC side, I think it would be to don't assign the right to manage your claim and handle your claim to the person that calls you after the storm or shows up on your doorstep. Just don't give away too much of your right to handle that yourself.
I think I'm always advising, and we've been talking, and as we're educating, is for the property and casualty side, or health, all of them. We've been teaching it, producers and publics. One is go to your insurance company and get in writing from your insurance company what your coverage is. Get in writing from your insurance company whether that procedure or claim is paid. Consumers too much are relying on all these providers, and it's really, the hard part is, you want to help facilitate getting the claim resolved. I have a heart, I want to protect the consumer, and often, unfortunately, it's the body shop, or it's the contractor, or it's the doctor's office has misinformed the consumer and they relied on them. And that puts it in a hard place because the insurance company actually sent them information telling them what was covered or what wasn't, but they just continued to listen to whoever that service provider is. So we're constantly saying, get it in writing and get it from the insurance company.
Any other advice? So let's maybe see if everybody, if you're giving one piece of advice to consumers or producers, what are you giving these days?
Read your mail.
Don't
And your policy, yes.
I'll second that.
Don't just delete your emails and throw your mail away.
Yes.
I think the thing that I've most commonly been encouraging people to do is shop around. I think if we've seen an increase in volume related to rate increases, I think it's important for people to not just rely on the piece of paper they got in the mail, assuming they even opened it or read it or understand what it says, but to go out and try and see if there is comparable coverage available for a lesser price. I don't know how often people do that, but I know insurance companies think that they don't do it often enough, and so, you know, I think that it's pretty helpful for us to encourage them to do that.
Any other pieces of advice?
No, I disagree with what they said. And one of the things that we tell our consumers when we're out, we understand that policies, it's a lot going on within that policy, but we always tell them, if you don't read anything else, read the exclusion page. At least you'll know what's not covered before you have to file a claim. So.
And so maybe in the spirit of advice, but if there were one thing in a claims process or two things in a claims, I assume that you all would rather fewer come to you because that means that something has gone wrong in the process, yes. Right? So if there's one piece of advice that you could either give to insurers or to, you know, other folks who are involved in the transaction, what would you do to say, I think a couple people, you know, we can't change feelings and we can't change motivations, so let's leave those aside. But are there things that you would say really help to either prevent complaints to come to you or help resolve them, you know, quickly and efficiently when they do come?
Take notes and try and exchange correspondence in writing. For my team and I, when it comes to people that have submitted a complaint and they've taken some kind of notes or they have emails or letters that are time or date stamped, that becomes really vital for us trying to piece together what it is that happened and whether there's something we can do to try and assist.
You mentioned motivations and not being able to, you know, necessarily speak to that, but I think the advice is a good piece of advice is to try to remain as unemotional as you can, even though people are in the midst of some sort of trauma, right? Either some devastation happened to their property or, you know, their health or someone's life, and it's really hard for folks. They're not always in a kind of a cognitive space where they can take in information and evaluate it objectively. It's really hard for folks to sometimes participate in the claim handling without being overly emotional and reactive, you know.
Any other things you wish were happening that would make everyone's lives a little easier? And then we'll send it out to the audience for questions. All right, in writing, read your mail. Remember that it's a human.
Just because you heard it once doesn't mean it's
real.
Yeah, that is, it's real.
All right, do we have any questions from the audience for our panelists? Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to repeat them, so shout it out and I'll repeat it. All right.
I was wondering, while listening to you, it seems there are certain factors that you're talking about. Do you write a sort of report that you publish? Do you put some publications specifically based on those factors? Tell people, well, like frequently asked questions, for instance. Thank you.
All right, so thank you. The question is, do you in your state have a method of reporting kind of back, and it could take I think frequently asked questions, or, and I won't steal TJ's answer, but or some sort of report to kind of document the trends we're talking about?
Tennessee does not. That's probably a good idea, though. I could see the value in that.
Yeah, in our state, we have something called an open data portal, and all of our complaint data goes there. So researchers, any interested person is able to go and sort of, you know, it doesn't trend spot for them necessarily, but definitely they're able to pull pretty much any, you know, any complaint data that they'd like based on reasons, you know, dispositions, things like that, yeah.
So Idaho, we don't public specific data, though there is some data available. We have annual reports and whatnot, but again, for me, the common questions and complaints are what drives the information on our website. And I mentioned it a while back, we had a lot of just tons of information on our website, and we tried to cut it down to just what are the most common questions and problems, be very brief, and then encourage them to give us a call. And for me, I'm looking for, we have a lot of people that are in remote areas. They may not have access to internet. I wanted it to be something that would be user-friendly, that if you're on a smartphone or a tablet, that you could find it. And so we find a lot of people do go to our website and find basic information and then call us.
I always think that this is somewhat of a double-edged sword because I think it takes a lot of effort and time to make sure that the data you're using to put out the report is accurate and up to date. And at the same time, I don't know how quickly someone accessing your website to view that report would feel that the data is no longer up to date enough. And so then it raises the question of how often for that report would you need to keep it updated to try and make sure that people still view it as current and accurate. And I don't know the answers. This is something that our agency, that Commissioner Arnold gets asked a lot of the time about, what data and what information do you have to share? And I think it's a real struggle to know where the tightrope line is. I would always like to have more information out there, but our resources are limited, so.
But I do think, too, there's the function of the market conduct, that they are constantly reviewing our data to look for trends. And as handling complaints, we can sense trends, but, State Department's insurance, it's typically a different function than consumer affairs, but you do have your market conduct area that's looking at that data and identifying trends in types of cases or trends with a specific company or agent even.
And I'll just add to TJ's answer, we do have a consumer, I don't remember what it's called. We do a report to the legislature every year, and they are most interested in understanding the call volume and wait time, and they don't care as much about what they're actually doing and whether the claims are real. So, anyone else I see back there?
There was someone in the middle.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just wondering if you have any, or any of the panelists have any thoughts on what to do about the advertising question, because I think consumers' most common everyday experience of insurance companies is through advertising. Insurance companies are advertising constantly. Or you look at any major metropolitan area, and the tallest, most prominent buildings are insurance companies' buildings. And I know that we've spent a lot of time talking about some of the things you have and they need to stay solvent, so they continue to pay claims. I know in our state that, I think on the property and casualty side, many of the companies have lost money over the last few years, which is all important data, but to a consumer it just sounds like, really? You're gonna cry poor when, you're constantly advertising and paying for Super Bowl ads?
I will say my kids know all of the jingles. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about maybe kind of perception or how perception shows up when you're dealing with complaints.
I find that in narratives a lot, right? So we might get a complaint from a consumer, and part of the narrative of that complaint might include, these people can't even get this claim right, but yet it's apparent that they're spending all of this money on advertising. So, people do get in a mindset, I think. Just an observation, though.
We don't get the advertising so much, but I do think there are certain entities, including insurance companies, that consumers seem to think that they have just this endless amount of money. And I've always said this, prior to being a regulator, I was a business person. You can't spend more money than you take in. There's still a business. And so, yeah, there's concerns, as a regulator, part of the function is to oversee their spending and finances, but there is that perception that I hear more just that they feel like they have just an endless amount of money and they should just pay that claim.
And we don't get too many complaints concerning the advertising, but they do hit on the salaries of the executives of those companies.
Yes,
I mean, that's a daily thing that we hear all the time.
All right, so I know that we are between you and cocktails. We have one quick question, and we'll do quick question, quick answers.
I'm in Kentucky, and we try to resolve our complaints within 30 to 45 days. What is your timeline?
All right, lightning round this one. John, you want to start?
I think we do about 90% within 30 days.
TJ?
I don't know if we're at 90%. It's a great question. I guess I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth. I think somewhat it depends. It depends on the number of issues and the complexity of the issues involved. I think a large percentage that we see in Minnesota can be resolved within that 30 to 45 days. Sometimes it's largely contingent on the people that we're seeking the information from getting us the information back to us, and that's something that's really out of our control. But you know, I do think it's fair to say that we certainly have certain issue types that go on much longer than the 30 to 45 day mark.
Cindy?
Our goal is 40 as an average, but we're running most recently close to about 60 days resolution time.
So our state law requires the carriers to respond to us within 30 days of receipt of our complaint. We actually ask for those responses within 2 weeks, but it does depend on the complexity of the case. Some cases, when there are structural engineers and those type of people involved, it's going to be extended timeout. So we have an internal metric where we try to close at least 90% of our cases within 90 days of receipt.
I don't have a specific timeline in South Dakota, but just as I mentioned earlier, the complexity has been so much more. Companies have 20 days to respond, but when you have to go back and forth 6, 7, 8 times, it certainly drags on.
And we do have strategic goals for 60 days. We try to resolve, or at least we do get back to the consumer within 30 days from when they initially hear from us. And we do let consumers know that typically it takes about 30 days, but we do reach out to the company within just a few days. And often that will initiate the company to try to contact the consumer and resolve it before they have to get back to us. But we're experiencing the same thing where there's problems, the complaints are taking a little bit longer. And a lot of those are those auto and home claims where they're disputing damages and value and whatnot.
All right, let's give a big hand to our panelists. Their contact information is up there. There were a number of topics that we wanted to get to but didn't have time, so if you want really fun cocktail party conversation, I'm sure all of them would be willing to talk to you about it. But thank you all for your time.